It's a real pleasure of being here, especially because this important farm-to-fork strategy is center stage during this webinar. And for us, from Fit for Food 2030, this is a very important policy document. Our project strongly supports the observations and objectives of the farm-to-fork strategy, and I would like to this presentation also very much linked to this strategy. The food system faces many persistent problems with respect to both agricultural production, and there we see, for example, pesticide residues, we have water scarcity and drought, there are problems in relation to animal welfare. On the consumption side, we see, for example, the malnutrition in some parts of the world, including low access to food, resulting in underweight. In the more affluent parts of the world, we see the other way around, where an abundance of unhealthy diets result in overweight and obesity. And what we have noticed is that these problems are very persistent. They are complex with many factors and actors involved, which makes them very difficult to solve. Basically, because they are embedded in the system. It's actually the system that's the problem. So we are now at a crossroads, actually, and that's why the farm-to-fork strategy is so timely. We can decide to do business as usual with only minor changes, but evidence piles up that this will be at the detriment of both people and planet. So we can also decide to go a second path, leading to a vision of a healthy, sustainable, resilient planet. However, there is growing consensus that we actually need to urgently transform our food systems if we want to achieve that. We also fully endorse the conclusion of the farm-to-fork strategy that research and innovation should play a key role in helping us to realize this second path. It can help in shaping more sustainable and healthy food systems. Research and innovation can act as a catalyst in various ways. First of all, it could create a sense of urgency by deepening our understanding of the problems and their consequences. This is important to raise awareness among a wide variety of stakeholders, and it could facilitate policy change and investment. Second, research and innovation can act as a catalyst by identifying breakthrough innovations, leverage points that could really get things going, both technical and social innovations. And a third role is to better understand the food system dynamics. I mentioned before that actually problems are very much embedded in the system, so understanding food system dynamics is very important. However, much research is done to solve problems in our food systems, and there are many examples to do that. But at the same time, we find that many of the innovations don't flow into society smoothly. We face problems. And actually, this is where we would like to add to the Fit for Food strategy, or I mean the farm-to-fork strategy, because there's not much attention to this. Actually, the track record of research is not doing so well. First of all, we see in general low rates and levels of adoption. Much of the research results are shelved. If they do find their way into society, often we see that scaling up hardly takes place or at a very slow pace because embedding in existing structures turns out to be difficult. And if adoption and scaling up does take place, we often see unforeseen side effects occurring, which reduce the overall effectiveness. So why is the role of R&I as problem solver not living up to its expectations? Well, first of all, turning to evaluation studies, we see that the linear approach that is taken in much of the research is causing this relatively poor performance. solving problems by breaking them down into solvable sub-problems, which is often the case nowadays in research, and then having a sequence of understanding the problem, doing the research, and then handing it over to society to implement it, is actually causing what we would call the implementation gap. And so we need to change something about this traditional linear approach. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. Basically, there is what we call a double complexity. First of all, the problems in the food system are very complex. They are multi-layered, multifactorial. But secondly, they manifest themselves in a complicated context. For instance, as an entry point for food system transformation, a change in food consumption practices is often envisioned. So people need to eat more diverse, less junk food, less meat, etc. In other words, we need a shift to healthy and sustainable diets. However, changing dietary patterns is notoriously complicated. It is not just about individual behavior, it's about biological and cultural factors, such as genetic makeup and beliefs. It's about the broader socio-cultural drivers, such as poverty and infrastructure. But it also involves the food environment factors, such as the abundance of cheap junk food outlets and marketing, and food supply chain factors, such as monocultural production and processing by large multinationals. So research and innovation thus needs to take into account all these different factors at different levels in this total environment. So single issue strategies will be unable to solve complex food system problems. Only by chance it once in a while might, but in general, this is not the approach to take. Experts are increasingly calling for research that goes beyond a focus on only food production or consumption and takes into account all these middle elements like processing, packaging, and transport, taking into account the interconnections, the feedback loops, the synergies and trade-offs. So there is an urgent need to understand the behavior in the system so that we can anticipate that behavior and strategize for realizing co-benefits and addressing trade-off. We can then act more effectively, and this is actually what we call system thinking. And that's what we from Fit4Food think is a very important prerequisite for research and innovation to be effective. System thinking is a way of looking at the world, how the world works, that is markedly different from the traditional reductionistic analytical view. It's a school of thought that focuses on recognizing interconnections between parts of a system and looks at it and synthesizes it to a whole. Taking into account all these different aspects, going beyond it and designing and implementing innovations, that is the way to proceed. So we need to adopt a food systems approach to research and innovation. But we still need to take it one step further. Embracing complexity, well, it requires courage. It requires an open mind to other disciplines, and it requires interdisciplinary collaboration, as well as collaboration with a lot of stakeholders. Because to fully understand the many social and cultural drivers, it requires input from professionals and end users, citizens, consumers. And so this brings us to the second prerequisite, active stakeholder engagement. We need to create tangible spaces where we have all these different stakeholders to engage and learn from each other and do joint problem solving. That means that we're then talking about inter- and transdisciplinary research. So we have systems thinking and inter- and transdisciplinary research. Now, to create these tangible spaces, we need a research and innovation system that can do that. Unfortunately, we see that there are barriers. And these barriers are, I would like to highlight 5 barriers. First of all, we see that the R&I landscape is rather fragmented in separated disciplines and sectors. Next, we see that actually, especially civil society, consumers, farmers, citizens, so they are not so much involved yet in research and innovation. So research is not really transdisciplinary, and one of the reasons for that is that there is not much support in R&I funding programs and from academic structures. It's mainly focused on outputs such as many publications in high-impact journals instead of interacting with a wide variety of stakeholders, particularly something like citizens. Another thing is that the private sector investments in research and innovation are not so much focused on food system transformation. They have many topics, but not so much the food system transformation. And apart from the private sector, actually the public funding programs don't do so much better in this respect. We see a lot of open calls instead of system-oriented calls. So food and nutrition and food systems transformation is not a focal point. So also here we can say, again, if we go business as usual, actually it's not very likely that research and innovation will actually contribute very effectively to future-proofing our European food system. So actually we need a double system transformation. We need to change our food system as well as our R&I system. And that's actually the core focus of the FIT4Food project. We are focusing on the food system transformation by changing the research and innovation system. And in that respect, it explicitly supports at this moment, the so-called Food2030 policy framework of the EEC. This translated in our FIT4Food project in setting up several tangible spaces, the so-called Food2030 Platform. Here we bring together a wide range of stakeholders at different levels. First, we have established 11 policy labs in different European countries where stakeholders jointly work together. The aim is to develop integrated policies on research and innovation. Second, we have established city labs in 14 European countries. Here, stakeholders develop joint visions on what a future-proof food system would look like and how to get there. We have also established an EU-level think tank consisting of 15 stakeholders active in a wide variety of international arenas. The think tank plays an important role in linking the different levels. And it also provides advice to the European Commission and especially the Food2030 program. And one way of communicating the advice is through policy briefs. And I would like to close my presentation by highlighting one of these policy briefs. And that is specifically the one that provides advice on the Farm to Fork strategy of the European Commission. And it focuses on the need for an improved research and innovation governance. So other ways of how research and innovation is commissioned. Now, the first advice addresses the problem that the current policy landscape for commissioning R&I does not adequately support systems thinking. As I mentioned before, research programs are scattered across different sectors and disciplines. In contrast, in the new governance context, R&I programs should actually transcend sectors and disciplinary boundaries and actively engage stakeholders throughout the research and innovation process. So that means that programs should explicitly support this new R&I approach. Secondly, it is important to realize well-targeted investments. It is not just about process, but also about achieving certain outcomes. So with research, we want to achieve something. So that needs research agendas. Agendas on both technological and social innovations. And that could act as leverage points for food system change. This requires careful targeting and co-creation. So a co-creation process in which shared visions, goals and action plans are formulated. Now, last but not least, the success of the new R&I approach depends on complementary investments in research, in education and training. Given the novelty of the approach, most researchers and professionals have not been trained in system thinking and stakeholder engagement. It is thus very important to build capacity. More financial resources should therefore be invested to support learning, not just in schools and universities or other educational institutions, but also the training of professionals, perhaps even on the job. Realizing this new research innovation governance, we foresee a very important role for funding agencies who could take up the role as innovation brokers. They can act as catalysts, setting up targeted programs that support the system thinking and stakeholder engagement. And we really very much hope that the Farm to Fork strategy in a next publication will develop such an innovative research innovation governance framework, so as to ensure that research innovation can really live up to its promise and contribute to the much needed food system transformation. Thank you very much for your attention.